Hey everyone, Mary and Delicia back. We are here to talk about or continue the conversation of Ameriguayas. Today is a special day in Paraguay, which is Dia de la Amistad. So if you're Paraguayan or in the US and have family and friends still in Paraguay, I'm sure your WhatsApp was blowing up today with the family group chats or the cousin group chats. I got a million of those like memes today, which is a good connection and reminder as to what's happening in country in Paraguay, and then reminding us to take a day and to commemorate our friends, which is fun that I'm doing today with Mary to celebrate Dia de la Amistad and talk about all things that we love, which is Paraguay and learning Guaraní and just growing up in the US. So we have a little Guaraní lesson, mini lesson that we're going to start incorporating, and so we also learn Guarani words and teach you all. And one that I received today that I really liked is, I'll say it in Spanish, and then Mary's going to kind of translate it for us, and then we can practice the word. So, en Guaraní, amistad tiene una connotación muy linda. Se dice angiru. La palabra está compuesta por anga, que significa alma, e iru, que significa compañero, es decir, compañero del alma.
Yes. So I'm going to translate in English. So for those of you who are watching who don't know Spanish, English, English, who don't know Spanish or Guarani, that basically translates to, in Guarani, amistad, which means friend, has a meaning or a connotation that means, or that's really nice or beautiful. Se dice, so they say angiru, which is the Guarani word we're learning today. Angiru. I'm going to go Spanglish here because my brain is code switching from Spanish to English to Guarani right now. So the word comes from angua, which means alma, which means soul, and iru, which means compañero, which means companion or friend. So they say compañero del alma, which means friend of the soul, soul friend, soul sister, soul brother. So that is the word for today, angiru. And so Dia de la Amistad, happy Friendship Day to everyone. And yeah, it's great to be doing this today on Friendship Day.
Yes.
So I guess before we get started and I have Delicia introduce what we're going to talk about today, we also just wanted to quickly go over the history of Guarani and the language, since we will be incorporating that going forward. It's very unique to Paraguay, and I feel like it's something important to bring to light and introduce to all of you who may not know about it. So Guarani is the indigenous language of Paraguay, and it's one of probably the only countries out there that still speak their native language, and a majority of non-indigenous people speak Guarani alongside Spanish, which is, the colonized language of Paraguay. And so, like I mentioned, Guarani is majority language is still spoken there, and it didn't become a national language until 1992, which was a few years after Stroessner was no longer the dictator in Paraguay. So that kind of ties into the history of Paraguay, the language, the indigenous people. And what makes Paraguay unique is that we have two national languages. So I'm going to hand over the mic to go into a little bit more details about the language, and then, like I said, introduce the topics we'll be talking about today.
Yeah, I love talking about Guarani in Spanish because, like Mary said, Paraguay is one of the very few countries that has two official languages, and two emblems on their flag. So behind me, you can only see one. I don't know if this flag has the other one. No. So the original flag has two emblems, right? The coat of arms and then this República de Paraguay emblem. So comparing to the US actually doesn't have an official language. So I find it so interesting how we're connected through language, through culture, and growing up, like our parents would speak in Guaraní with our grandparents and our aunts and uncle, and I didn't really understand a lot, and sometimes we would joke they would speak in Guaraní so we wouldn't understand. But then as we got older and then living in Paraguay, I learned a little bit more. So I'm excited to incorporate this as part of our topics and conversation, and talking today about the three main, I guess, buckets of conversations that we're going to have is about acculturation, assimilation into U.S. culture while navigating Paraguayan and Guarani culture at home, right? We learn dances that are very focused in the folklore and Guarani culture growing up in New Jersey. And then we're going to expand on how do we connect all of that to solidarity with Black Lives Matter, because that is going to be part of the focus of our conversation. How do Latinos, Paraguayans show up for in solidarity for Black lives? And then talk a little bit about someone that we learned about, Silvia Diaz, and her work as Afro-Paraguaya, and really deconstruct the community that is marginalized in Paraguay, in addition to indigenous peoples, and how language is marginalized. And so those are kind of the framework topics that we wanted to discuss. We always talk about these things like when we're hanging out and really like, oh, you saw this article and this, but we really feel it's important to bring it to a larger scale. That's why we're having these Zoom chats to share with you all. So I hope you find it interesting.
Yes. So we will start with introducing Silvia Diaz. And so she goes by Silvia Diaz de Moore. She was married to American, so typically when you see de Moore, it's the last name that they take on from their spouse. So Silvia Diaz, so I had come across an article when learning about the Afro-Paraguayan population, and her name pops up a lot. And so the first article that I saw came up on Jemezcla, and they actually gave her, I guess, recognition for being a woman and doing work in Paraguay in the Afro-Paraguayan community. So she studied, I believe she studied law in Paraguay. So she went to la Universidad Técnica Comercialización y Desarrollo. So that's where she went. She studied law there. And then she worked as a lawyer in Paraguay from 2006 to 2008. And then she moved to the US to continue her degree and get a Master of Law from the University of Baltimore. So she's currently living in Maryland. And so what she does is she's a huge advocate for immigrants. And she also advocates for her people from Paraguay, and she identifies as Afro-Paraguaya. So she talks a lot about race within Paraguay. She talks a lot about being Afro-Paraguaya, Afro-Latina in the US, and how race is still an issue. She talks about being a woman and the struggles that she goes through by being a woman as well. So there's a lot of different layers. She does a lot of work, which I think is awesome. I was talking to Delicia prior, and we're really trying to connect with her.
Yeah.
We would love to bring her on and have a conversation with her. She represented Kamba Kua, which is the Afro-Paraguayan community that she's part of. So she actually went to the UN in 2001 and was one of two representatives from Paraguay. And so she went there to for a UN conference on racism and xenophobia. So that just goes to show, the work that she does and why it's important to talk about her, to talk about the Afro-Paraguayan community as we continue the dialogue of Black Lives Matter, of racial injustice going on in the US, because it happens worldwide, like we mentioned in our last episode. So that's a little background on her. And Delicia, do you have anything to add or want to continue the conversation there?
Yeah, I think it's important to bring her up, apart from us wanting to connect with other people to have these conversations with us. But even this week, when the Emmy nominations were given out, and a lot of white identifying Latinos posted on Twitter and were like, what about Latino representation? What about us? And they're excluding the Afro Latinos who were nominated for Emmys.
Yeah.
So I find it so interesting that we're obviously having this conversation, and then we see it play out on the larger scale, like in the Twitter sphere, and kind of showcasing the anti-Blackness in the Latino community, and how we're trying to educate ourselves to see, are there roots of it in Paraguay? Yes, there are. And how do we connect with these people, but also show solidarity with them? And when I saw that, when was it? Yesterday or the day before it was announced? And I was like, oh, we were talking about this activist, Silvia, who is bringing light to these issues and has been doing it in the UN, and all the work that she's doing. So hopefully we can have her in a chat one day, and she can expand more on like the history and like the direct action updates that she's doing.
Right. Yeah, I think it's so important to talk about the anti-Blackness within the Latino community, because it is really prevalent right now, like you just mentioned, in pop culture. You see it in the Emmys right now, and it's ironic that you bring that up, because I was also looking at that in my Twitter or my Instagram, and that I saw some Latinos, even some Afro-Latinas, Latinos, who, were like, well, what about us? And it continues to be that dialogue of, what about us? And there are Black people in our communities. And so, yeah, that's why I want to continue that conversation and bring up Silvia Diaz and recognize her work that she is doing within not only the Latino community, but the Paraguayan community as well.
Yes. And if you're listening and you don't maybe understand what anti-Blackness means, it just means that so in a framework of identities, we all hold whiteness because we operate under this white society, whiteness as the dominant culture. And anti-Blackness is kind of trying to prescribe more towards whiteness than Blackness. So it's all based on phenotype, right? So based on skin color. And if someone's talking about anti-Blackness, they're saying that you not you as a person, but like in a particular way, someone is showing up in an anti-Blackness way to try to uphold whiteness as privilege, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And trying to maybe, and it might not happen consciously or like very overtly, it might, but it also operates very unconsciously and very like subtly, like these comments on Twitter and in popular culture. And that's just showcasing their anti-Blackness, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. So like we mentioned last week as well, their oppressor is ours. We're in the same fight together. And so it's so important to recognize that and also be self-aware of those unconscious biases or those unconscious realizations of, do I, assimilate more with, whiteness. And so, yeah, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, not only learning, but also self-reflecting on where, our biases lie and wanting to change that. And of course, doing the work for that and really feeling it and really assessing, oneself and how can I change myself, or how can I better be aware of this, that I may be acting a certain way, or that I do have more privilege
Mm-hmm.
because of my whiteness. So those are a lot of things that, right now and always, we have to think about.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So that kind of goes into what you wanted to also discuss today, which was white assimilation, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go ahead and give you.
I think it ties into like what we experienced just growing up here, right? Our parents have made decisions when they just got here in the 80s and early 90s, or late 80s, early 90s, of assimilation and acculturation. So I know a lot of people that their parents were told not to teach Spanish to their kids because it's going to mess up them learning English. So some parents didn't teach Spanish. So there are a lot of first generation children of immigrants who don't speak Spanish because they didn't want them to fall behind or be bullied or discriminated against in class. And that's part of, now as an adult and as an educator, I understand that that's part of upholding whiteness and upholding white supremacy in the US and the world. But when you're little, you're not understanding and operating under those academic terms.
Right.
And now we know cognitively, if you speak more than one language, it really helps you. It helps your brain develop. It gives you more cognitive skills, more critical thinking abilities. And so it's really, and a lot of people want to learn second and third languages now when they're in college or as adults to help them in the workforce. And it would have been so much easier if maybe their parents had just let them learn when they were little.
Right.
And that's part of like our assimilation and acculturation into this culture, because we are first generation. We are the first born in this country, and that's all part of erasure of culture and erasure of identity, which I think happens also in Paraguay, right? We opened up about Guaraní and Spanish, and it's important to understand that yes, Guaraní is taught in schools in Paraguay. However, people who speak it daily are maybe viewed as less than, or that their Spanish isn't as good because it's mixed with Guarani. So it's Yopara, right? The mixture of both of them, and sometimes viewed as less than, or as campesino. And that's all rooted in colonial mentality and white supremacy, right? Like just because the U.S., I mean, Central and South America was colonized by Spain doesn't mean they hold white supremacy ideals. Of course they do. It's all part of the patriarchy. So I say that because we, as like Mary and I, are both firstborn, and we're firstborn sisters and firstborn like going to college. So we've navigated different spaces, and like what's in Spanish would be like, I learned a mi costilla, like I learned through, literally translate through like hits to my gut or like my ribs. I mean, it sounds better in Spanish, but like a phrase, like an idiomatic phrase, like a mi costilla, aprendí a mi costilla, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we had to learn a lot of things just like by doing it and living in this world. Anyways, that's a conversation for another day. But that's kind of what I wanted to like share about acculturation, assimilation, and how we might even adopt like ways in how we speak that's more closely to whiteness, because we went to predominantly white schools, and we were in middle class, upper class communities in high school. So, I mean, I didn't go to middle school here. I was in Paraguay. So that's a whole other story. But
Yeah, I love that you connected it to Guarani and Spanish in Paraguay, and how you said that, the Guarani language is kind of looked down upon if you spoke it, whereas now they're introducing it to the schools where that wasn't always taught. And it's interesting because that ties to our experience here in the US, and then our parents having to navigate speaking Spanish and learning English. So then
Mm-hmm.
where you and I had to kind of teach English, speak English. I believe my first language at home was actually Spanish.
Yeah,
And
same.
yeah, my parents used to speak to me in Spanish all the time. I still speak to my dad in Spanish and I speak
Mm-hmm.
to my mom in English. Um, and I always tell my mom, I'm like, Mom, why didn't you like continue speaking Spanish to us? But, it's also understanding their side. And, they also had to learn English because of how speaking a different language is seen in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So, once we started school, then that's when we learned English. And then that's when we brought it home. And, we were learning and teaching English at the same time. So that really does tie in with Guaraní and Spanish in Paraguay as well. And I'm sure what they go through while speaking
Mm-hmm.
their native languages.
Right. Yeah, because they speak Guarani at home in some places and then go to school and then it's taught in Spanish. So the duality of everything.
Mhm. Yeah, so it's a lot to unpack. I mean, within the conversations that we had today, there's a lot to talk about still, being
Mm-hmm.
first generation, that
Mm-hmm.
experience, and just, I don't know, our experiences with keeping the culture of Paraguay as
Mm-hmm.
well in the home. Um, so there's a lot to talk about still.
Yes. And if you're listening, and if you want to talk about something that you've experienced or that you've known, and you're like, oh, you guys should talk about this or you should bring this up. I mean, we have a list of ideas that we're going to keep bringing on. But if there's some like a hot topic that you really want to address or want us to address or do it together, let us know. But I think talking about being first gen, being first daughter has a lot of cultural nuances that I think would be an interesting talk. And how Paraguayan women, how women are treated versus men, how daughters are treated versus sons, I think is an interesting dynamic. And we can deconstruct that and try to unpack it, because I'm pretty sure we've come across different situations or experiences that it's like, oh, is that like American? Is that Paraguayan? Like, what's happening here?
Right. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. And like Delicia said, if you have any suggestions or any topics that you want us to discuss or you want to join us in conversation, we are definitely open. We appreciate the feedback that we got after our first
Yeah.
official video on the topic. So we're going to continue the conversation, and thank you to everyone who tuned in. And so I guess I'll end with the or the Guarani word of the day, which is Angi. Rohayhu, Paraguay.